We're delighted to have started these seminars again at the end of last year. My name's Pat Hannam. I work in my day job as County Inspector Advisor for RE History and Philosophy, and recently now the Vice Chair of AULRE. Sean Whittle is also here as Chair of AULRE, so both of us welcome you very much to this evening. We're delighted that Dr. David Lewin is able to be with us to lead this webinar. I first met David, or came across David, when he gave a most stunning paper at a Philosophy of Education Society conference some years ago, later published as Behold, Silence and Attention, in relation to religious education. On that basis, I thought this is the person to be my external examiner for my PhD, and I was really, really pleased that David accepted that, and it was a privilege to have my thesis examined by him, despite the spelling mistakes and the odd punch. David then contributed to a seminar that Gert Biester and I facilitated at Brunel, and that's most recently been published in a book last year. But David's work in that on pedagogical reduction, there's a great synergy, I think, with what he's going to be talking about tonight. So I'd very much like to welcome David and commend him to you. David is hugely well regarded in both the philosophy of education world as well as the RE world, and that is quite a tricky balance, I would say, and it just says something very serious about his scholarship. The work that he's presenting to us tonight, After Religious Education, funded by Column St. Gabriel's Trust, as well as we were discussing this, and the reality also, the universities, the supporting himself and colleagues being involved with this. We're very interested to hear about this work. David's going to speak for around and about 50 minutes or so, and then we'll open a discussion and conversation about the project. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, Pat, and thanks everyone for coming. As usual, I can't really see very much of you, which is always slightly disappointing in these occasions, but anyway, I really want to thank you for taking the time to come out on this, well, at least round in Glasgow, rather miserable evening. So yeah, as Pat said, I'll speak for about 45-50 minutes or so, and I look forward to conversations about it. Thanks also, obviously, for the invitation and the introduction, indeed, Pat, to do this. So today I want to talk about the After Religious Education project. I want to say something about what it is, what it's trying to do, what its aims are, what it hopes to achieve, and why it's worth undertaking at all. I'll say something about the background context in which the project developed, and then a bit about how we intend to go on. So it's fairly early days in the project just now. And ultimately, something about where we are going, I guess, which means I'm going to talk in particular, I guess, about the concept of pedagogical reduction, which I think is particularly relevant and of interest to RE teachers, practitioners and theorists and so forth. So the rather grandiose aims of the After Religious Education project are to explore the nature of the educational representation of religion and to support the development of a new vision for religious education, or religion and worldviews. So let me begin then with a word of thanks to Column St. Gabriel's Trust, who funded the project. I'm really grateful to Column for the opportunity to explore these aims, but translating them into specific tasks and practices isn't that easy. The abstract that I sent round for this talk was an attempt to do just that. So yeah, my slide has brought up the two key questions that I sent round as part of the abstract. What should the pedagogical logic of the representation of non-religions in RE be? And secondly, how can this pedagogical logic be illustrated through the development of exemplary curricular materials? Now, I'm going to imagine that these questions are still not entirely clear to you, so let me say a bit more about them. Firstly, we are interested in the educational or pedagogical logic of RE. By pedagogy, I simply mean here the theory and practice of teaching in a broad sense. And so pedagogical logic refers to the kind of reasoning or the logic on which that practice and theory are based. If we can develop that kind of logic, it should offer us criteria by which to make judgments about how to approach the representation of religions and, of course, non-religions in RE. The first step, then, is to try to articulate what the pedagogical logic of RE ought to be, which would include knowing something about the criteria we would use when engaging in the educational representation of religion and non-religion. So every time I say religion, I have to add non-religion. So where I don't do that, please accept that that's what I mean. Should every religion be included, for instance? And if that's not possible or desirable, then by what logic do we decide what to include and what to leave out? The question of pedagogical logic also raises the issue of what the object of inquiry ought to be. What, in other words, should RE be about? We might begin with the apparently common sense assumption that RE should be about religion. But of course, the term religion is hardly uncontested. That, along with the rise of diverse forms of non-religion, should make us pause. How should RE respond? How does a pedagogical logic help us to determine what RE is about and what it is for? Now, my second question there follows on from this first question of pedagogical logic. So rather than define some abstract and normative pedagogical logic, it would be more interesting and possibly for many of us more helpful to see concrete examples. So this would bring us to the second phase of the project after religious education, which is indeed to develop exemplary curriculum materials. And it's my view that these materials are best developed on the basis of the clear pedagogical logic, which we hope will come out of this first phase, this first question. And this first question is really the focus of my talk today. But you may ask, what justifies this view that the pedagogical logic of RE is worth pursuing at all? After all, it's very likely that many skilled and competent teachers can and do produce excellent RE lessons, curricula, without explicitly at least going through the process of reflecting on and articulating their pedagogical logic. Skilled, experienced and knowledgeable teachers can exercise their judgment to ensure that their materials are relevant to students and inclusive of subject matter. So if RE is working, what need is there for the development of the pedagogical logic that supposedly underpins it? Well, the short answer here is that RE seems to not be working all that well. I already suggested that, yes, there is a lot of good practice, but it seems not to be consistent. A number of policy developments, subject reports, other pieces of research cast doubt on the general quality and significance of RE, at least the perceived significance of RE across England and Wales. For instance, consider Cooling and Panjwani's Theos reports, Worldviews in RE, which begins by outlining the significant threat facing the subject today. Longer term socio-cultural trends, I've mentioned already the rise of diverse forms of non-religion, as well as perhaps the engaging with complex post-secularisms, you might call them, spiritual but not religious, between religion and non-religion, that kind of liminal space. These changes, these trends indicate that whatever we might mean by RE, it is not a fixed thing. Change is a feature of this subject, and the time seems to be right for what Trevor Cooling has called a paradigm shift in RE, or at least some considerable reform. But on what basis are changes to be made? That indeed is the question behind the inquiry into pedagogical logic. Before going any further, I must say that the two questions that I've presented might bring to mind a hierarchy which I'm particularly keen to avoid, namely the hierarchy of theory over practice. Let me make it really clear right now that any pedagogical logic should be grounded in and informed by practice. Please do not interpret this as a case of an educational theory offering some pedagogical logic which is then passed down from academics in universities to be interpreted and enacted by RE teachers in schools. It is vital to emphasise here that that the practice, whether that's in schools, universities, or in other contexts, other educational contexts, informs the theory as much as the theory may result in changes to practice. So the relation of theory to practice, as I want to try and show throughout this presentation, is ongoing and it's dialectical. So I'm going to move my slides. Hopefully that's worked. So let me say a little bit more then about the context and genesis of our project. The provocative title, After Religious Education, is not meant to suggest that we get beyond RE, but is intended to resonate with a couple of things that are on the screen. First, I intend to bring to mind the title of Chris Cotter and David Robertson's edited volume, After World Religions. Perhaps many of you are familiar with this book. It seeks to provide a rationale for overhauling so-called world religions curriculum that have been so influential within university courses on religion. Many of these themes can be extended and applied to the context of school. Second, I want to think through some of the implications of the 2018 report by the Commission on Religious Education. That, among other things, makes the case for renaming to religion and worldviews. I will say now that I have some reservations about this renaming and the reframing that it implies. But in general, I'm sympathetic to the drift of the report. And since I developed this project, I also feel I ought to say something about myself beyond what Pat has so nicely introduced. So I am a senior lecturer in education studies at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. I do have a background in theology and religious studies. That was my first degree. And I did do a PGCE in RE and briefly taught RE in a Catholic college. My PhD was fairly philosophical in nature on Heidegger, technology and religion. And that was within a department of religious studies. And these days I tend to do work within, I would say, broadly construed religious education, or you might say religion and education, the interaction between those concepts. I generally identify myself as a philosopher of education, and I do that with some hesitancy, I must admit. But that for me entails theoretical research on foundational educational questions. In particular, I've been working with colleagues at Strathclyde from the Germanic tradition of educational theory to translate and interpret some educational concepts that are almost non-existent in Anglophone educational theory. Specifically, I've been interested in interpreting and extending the theory of pedagogical reduction, which I will say more about later, but in essence is the theory of the selection, simplification and representation of aspects of the world for educational purposes. I think that the concept of pedagogical reduction has particular resonance for religious studies in universities and of course religious education in schools, partly because it shifts the emphasis away from rearranging and expanding curriculum content, which is one move that I'm going to talk about, towards rather thinking about general pedagogical logic, which is what I want to emphasize here. Okay, but before I get to that, let me say a bit more about this genesis of the project then. While working in this interdisciplinary context, I've been struck by the observation that how we think about teaching religion is rather fragmented. So I kind of am interested in these three domains: classroom practice, education studies as a theoretical discipline, the academic study of religion or religious studies. But they're rather fragmented. There is much good teaching happening in schools and universities. There is significant research being done within the academic study of religion to examine how the subject matter has been developed or has developed and might be redefined and reframed. And also, thirdly, there is some interesting work happening in education studies that theorizes the production and representation of subject matter. While there are some opportunities for dialogue between these three domains, these three communities, I think on the whole, they tend to work rather independently. So our project really is an attempt to bring together these communities into a more unified community of practice, a community of theory and practice. On the screen now is the participants, and you can see a link at the bottom there, which is our website. So please feel free to, that's not the easiest one to note down, but anyway, pop along to the website as you see fit. So in the second half of 2021, I invited 13 people working within and across these three domains to join the project. And in practice, most of those involved cut across these three domains quite a bit. Nearly half of the group are school teachers, and actually most have been school teachers before, well, many of them were school teachers before moving into university posts. Because the basic questions of the project are to do with pedagogical logic, I also wanted to ensure that there were some scholars here working in the continental pedagogy tradition. The trade-off there was that continental colleagues might not be so familiar with the context of RE in England and Wales. So I've had to balance perspectives between familiarity and awareness of context with a broader pedagogical perspective. So we've had initial one-to-one meetings, and we've begun to articulate our own perspective and orientation to the questions, the project aims. Unfortunately, our first main group meeting, which was scheduled to be in January, had to be postponed for reasons that I'm sure you can guess. So we are a bit behind schedule. Everything's been a bit delayed, but in some respects that's no bad thing. I think I'd rather we develop things slowly and well. The plan is to present and debate the various interests and perspectives that the participants bring. And these conversations will be directed towards developing principles of pedagogical logic for RE. Participants will refine their thinking so that teachers in the group can then develop some exemplary curriculum materials in order to illustrate the logic at work. So the teachers being part of the conversation about developing the logic and then exemplifying that in practice. The intention here is not to produce complete schemes of work, of course, but to give a grounded understanding of these principles or the logic that can inform further developments. And of course, we will publish our findings both in terms of its logic as well as the particular examples. So where do we think we're going to go with all of this? Let me offer a slightly different formulation of the main question, which brings to view a particular tension that we're interested in. How can teachers of RE and RS be inclusive while also being selective? A pedagogical logic could be characterized as aspiring to full inclusion. What notion of inclusion is consistent with appropriate pedagogical selection? I've already hinted at the problem that teachers can't cover everything, and yet one general idea of inclusion would suggest that nothing should be excluded or left out. So what kind of concept of inclusion do we have in mind in that case? Well, a popular notion of inclusion would be for all students to somehow feel represented by subject content. What does that mean? That might mean that the religious traditions and cultures discussed in classes reflect those of the students. that the students see themselves, they see their experiences, their context discussed, and have opportunities to engage with that. The subject matter should represent the diversity of the class constituted by different genders, ethnicities, social backgrounds, and so on. As well as exploring different religious and non-religious identities, this might mean that the subject also considers the ways that religious traditions have reflected certain prejudices. In other words, how have white, male, Eurocentric perspectives dominated the construction of subject matter? And what do we do about that? The notion of inclusion has many advantages. Students may feel more engaged by subject matter that is perceived to be more relevant and representative. And we shouldn't underestimate the pedagogical significance of seeing one's story incorporated into subject matter, or even the alienating experience, more to the point, of a curriculum that seems disconnected from one's own lived experience. Moreover, the histories of sexism and patriarchy, of racism, colonialism, and so on, can be discussed within the subject, potentially helping to deconstruct and historicize those historical and ongoing injustices that beset social lives. But this notion of inclusion also, I think, raises significant problems. Are student identities that straightforward to categorize and represent? What of those who do not consider themselves religious? Doesn't the subject name itself exclude them? What about including complex intersectionality of differing religious backgrounds within individuals? That is, parents with different backgrounds, students themselves who consider themselves non-binary in terms of religion. And isn't it important to learn about traditions not necessarily represented among the student cohort? So for now, we could employ a simpler notion of inclusion, namely that all students should be taught together, regardless of any or no religious affiliation or background. While this shouldn't ignore the interests and proclivities of a specific set of students in particular contexts, the pedagogical logic could be primarily determined by the subject matter itself. In this case, I would also hope that the subject matter includes much that I just mentioned, namely an understanding of the sexist, racist, colonialist histories of religious traditions, for instance. These elements of understanding religion were not always considered a part of subject matter and might still not be universally recognised and included in RE. So this raises the very difficult question of how we determine what the subject matter actually is. We can hardly even agree as to what religion refers to, or whether it makes any sense at all to create hierarchies. Hierarchies such as world religions vis-a-vis indigenous, primitive, or marginal religions. And if we refer to the scholarly discipline of religious studies, then we invite, I think, some other kinds of problem. RS itself as a discipline, if it is a discipline, would hope that RE engages with the complexities of its subject matter in ways that it might not be used to. Essentially, there's an aspiration in that direction that RE could become what Tim Jensen has characterized as a mini science of religions. Now, for decades, scholars have complained that, and here's the quote here is on the slide. I've tried to ensure that all of my long quotes, which are not very long always, are there on the slide just to help in case you can't hear me so well. So scholars have long complained that RE tends to treat religions as discrete belief systems and cultures as separate bounded entities. Critical religious studies has explored a range of related questions and challenges. So there it is. How do we best account for the internal diversity mutability, permeability of religions. Is it meaningful to speak of discrete religions? Discussing these complexities certainly has its place in the teaching of religion, but at what level? Should we first provide children with a grasp of the general categories of world religions, which we can then later call into question? Should we encourage a kind of learning which then needs to be unlearned? Is this a sophisticated dialectical pedagogy? Or does it miss the point that authentic learning, whatever that is ultimately an encounter with something in the world? Without a clear disciplinary logic to govern the practices of definition and processes of selection and simplification, we may struggle with such questions and may simply default to the most commonplace notion of inclusion. Namely, teachers must understand and represent the complexity and scope of their subject. Who is going to argue against maximal depth and breadth? In his essay on the logic of exemplarity in education, the German pedagogue Martin Wagenschein has argued, and there's the quote again on the screen, has argued that the comprehensive approach to subject content is misguided. He says, an inherent temptation is completeness, which leads to haste and a lack of thoroughness. In our haste then to be comprehensive, the subject content risks becoming, he says, a diluted systematic course of study. He argues that we should have the courage to leave gaps, which means the courage to be thorough and to dwell intensively on selected topics. So I agree with much of what Wagenschein has to say, and while I do that, talk of leaving gaps, nevertheless, might give the impression that there is a fixed set of subject content that we must select from. But I think that this might be an unhelpful image because it doesn't emphasize that content is produced rather than simply selected from. In other words, there is a tendency to think about content, subject content, in terms of reified stuff that sits out there in the world like piles, rather than as something formed, produced by a pedagogical intention. Naturally, many teachers tend to focus on the what of their teaching, the material that must be taught and learned, the piles of stuff that must be transmitted. But the intended learning in the classroom surely goes well beyond a knowledge pile to include a range of moral and intellectual virtues and dispositions. Curiosity, confidence, patience, respect for others. These are surely important aspects of what children learn in school, even if we hesitate to call this educational content. When we see RE content in terms of an arbitrary number of reified, religious or not, traditions which constitute its essential content, we perhaps lose sight of important educational goals. Goals such as self-awareness or historical consciousness. So it seems to me this notion of transmission and content and transmission of content, it seems to me that we've largely forgotten that these are metaphors. And in my view, they're rather poor metaphors for education. We rather take these metaphors of transmission of content to be a more or less accurate description of education rather than metaphors we might take and leave. This metaphor, I think, also generates a particularly problematic relation to time for teachers in particular. A sense, I think, of time's extreme scarcity. Teachers are faced with a finite number of teaching hours on the timetable, into which an ever-increasing pile of content must be stuffed. Now, every teacher knows there are not enough hours, but an extreme sense of scarcity derives, I think, from a particular interpretation of the curriculum as ever-increasing piles that we attempt to fit into an allotted period of time. If we imagine education otherwise, we could see that the hours given to any curriculum subject can be used in any number of ways. We have the time that we have. Only by assuming that there are knowledge piles that we need to get through do we construct the educational problem in terms of time's scarcity. If we think differently about what it is we are trying to achieve, perhaps different approaches come into view. We might, for instance, develop a different pedagogical logic by which we select and represent some aspect of the world, one that doesn't necessarily define inclusion by comprehensiveness or direct representation, but finds alternative ways to include, understand, and represent. Of course, time is not unlimited, but moving away from the notion of content as knowledge piles might relieve that particular sense of scarcity that weighs so heavily upon the teaching profession. So a first step in reimagining RE is to recognise that how we frame curricula is important. We could choose to think of the curricula in terms of reified traditions or piles of content. The proposed shift to religion and worldviews from core reports would, in this context, offer us an opportunity to rethink which piles of content ought to constitute the curriculum. We might then decide to include representation of non-religious worldviews, for instance. We could, for instance, say, let's get humanism on the curriculum. This expansion of the curriculum would mean something else is squeezed out because we have imagined curriculum in terms of knowledge that must be fitted into finite slots. And I don't think this approach really addresses the issue. So our project aspires to something else, to reimagine RE by thinking through a different logic, one that imagines a different approach to education, an approach that emphasizes less the what of content and more the how of method. So let me offer a different metaphor, a more fruitful metaphor, a metaphor from John Dewey for education. Rather than transmitting stuff, education is the process of creating conditions in which students can learn and grow. Understood in this way, we are, at least for a moment, freed from the weighty traditions that must be passed on. Of course, that doesn't mean all our questions are immediately solved, but it means a different path opens. We are still left with questions of how to deal with depth and breadth, but from a different point of view. The model of content transmission, which aspires to a certain comprehensiveness, must confront the practical problems that stem from this model. Religious and non-religious traditions are inevitably reduced to stereotypes, generalizations made, complications overlooked. All sorts of potentially relevant phenomena are left out. Evidence of the predominance of this content model can be found in the fact that there are few voices calling for less on the curriculum, and even fewer calling for less complexity. On the contrary, the last 30 years of discussion of RE have seen near universal calls for greater complexity, more nuance, richer accounts of lived experience. In our aspiration to be inclusive, we risk losing sight of our subject matter. Is this a problem more for theory than for practice? Who in the end can save RE? I suspect that many teachers have not lost sight of their subjects, nor are they, or should I say, they also are able to exercise judgments about what to include and what to leave out. Teachers often do, in other words, draw attention to what is important by selecting and simplifying. But they're not really supported, I argue, by the theoretical interpretations of their subject, which expects, demands always more always better. They are called to be super teachers, expected to perform miraculous pedagogical alchemy in which everything is somehow present. Now, I believe that a more developed theory of pedagogical reduction, which I'll explain a bit more in a moment, would help us better understand what teachers do and will help to support practice. Pedagogical reduction is one of several educational concepts that we might develop as part of an RE curriculum logic. And I'm not going to discuss all the others, of course, in detail. I mean, the things like exemplarity. So Martin Wagenschein has written very interestingly about that. Grammatization, suspension of identity. I won't talk about all those, but in many respects, I think that pedagogical reduction is the most encompassing, since the other notions really extend and enrich it. So let me ask, what do I mean by pedagogical reduction? Or maybe I should explain something about this concept, which I have introduced without going into. So, as I've already mentioned, the concept pedagogical reduction refers to forms of educational selection, simplification, and representation. I understand education to refer to intentional acts. So I'm defining education in a particular way. That is, intentional acts that create conditions in which some kind of improvement or growth can take place. Thus, educators create various limitations which are, I say, pedagogically productive. They select particular things from the world to present educationally. They simplify particular things in the world. In other words, breadth is constrained by selection and depth is regulated by simplification. The educational theorist Dan Troller summarizes nicely, put the quote there on the slide: selection, condensation, composition, didactical structuring, and streamlining for classroom instruction. Now, as I already said, reference to selection and simplification might, if you've been listening carefully, you might notice that this might encourage a view of curriculum as knowledge piles to be transferred and to be selected from. Now, I want to ensure, therefore, that these ideas are consistent with the metaphor of creating conditions. You could even say that my own presentation began with an initial definition, an entry point into a subject, itself, therefore, a pedagogical reduction, and that this preliminary focus on selection and simplification helped to show something. But if we want to get into it in a more sophisticated way, we're going to have to complicate and change that, modify that interpretation. So I want to show that pedagogical reduction is concerning a student's relation to the world. So education is defined as trying to influence the student's relation to the world, and therefore that's what pedagogical reduction is concerned with, rather than knowledge piles being transferred. Okay, and the headline there, reduction is productive. So that's my overarching point. And on the screen, in case the images are not clear, we've got a textbook, we've got a museum exhibit with lights shining. We've got the canon of books, great books. We have a child's playground with a fence around it, and we have a telescope in the bottom. Okay, so the processes of pedagogical reduction are productive. By creating an aperture, by creating a perspective or point of view, reductions reveal something, but only by concealing something else. If we look through the lens of a telescope or microscope, our attention is drawn to something. The aperture simultaneously reveals and conceals. And it's through this productive process of limit that something can come into view. So as the slide is showing here, pedagogical reduction can take many different forms, from selecting texts considered to be important, so canons, canonical, the great books, to simplifying the causes of particular events or processes. So we might simplify the causes of an event like a war or an illness like cancer to understand something. To building fences around playgrounds to reduce exposure to risk, what you might call a spatial reduction. To making slow motion video, which could be used to improve someone's techniques, which isn't on the screen, but we might call that a temporal reduction. To arranging space and light in general to draw attention to particular things, such as in museums, and so on and so forth. So all of these examples involve, I argue, an intention on the part of an educator to show something, or to support a certain kind of learning by reducing something. So it may not be directly showing, but supporting learning. Like a chef who reduces a sauce, creates a reduction, a certain kind of learning, like a chef who reduces a sauce, the educator may hope to get to something essential by removing distractions. These forms of reduction focus attention not by denying the existence of what is excluded, but simply by drawing attention elsewhere. Thus, these reductions are not reductionist. They don't pretend to be complete. They don't pretend to be exhaustive representations. They're not the last word. Used properly, pedagogical reductions indeed should make us aware that we are taking a point of view. They should indeed generate a kind of self-consciousness. And it may be actually that self-consciousness is an important aspect of educational content, which I will come to at the end of my talk. Now, we could say that the textbook is itself, in the top corner, the world religions. The textbook is the textbook form of the pedagogical reduction. It selects and simplifies and represents in quite explicit, obvious ways. Many textbooks offer students an entry point into a subject without pretending to be the last word. Well, perhaps only bad textbooks fail to be explicit about their scope and limits. Yet when it comes to RE, well, probably most subjects, the accusations of reductionism of textbooks are rife. Textbooks are said to essentialize. They are too selective, they are simplistic, they are indeed even inaccurate or distorting. Textbooks are accused of creating an inauthentic or scholastic educational reality. Textbook Sikhism or Islam, for instance, is often characterized, or caricatured, I should say, as being a long way from the supposed lived experience of Sikhs or Muslims. Moreover, various ideologies or biases are evident in the way that subject matter is represented and reduced in the textbook. Can't we simply dispense with textbook accounts and encounter the living tradition? Well, whichever aperture is employed, however something is represented, whoever's interests govern the representation and reduction of the world, the logic of reduction as such cannot be avoided. It is part of the structure of human understanding and of education as such. So we always understand the world from a point of view, in other words. The key is to appreciate this and to consider what it means for how we employ our pedagogical reductions. How do they create conditions for education? In other words, how do we create and use pedagogical reductions? Understanding how reductions work should help us avoid the great sins of reductionism and exclusion. We would not generally call the fences of the children's play area reductionist or exclusionary. Rather, they create the conditions for children to play, interact, learn, and grow. Nor would we brand a child's balance bike reductionist just because it removes gears and brakes while the child is given the opportunity to develop balance. Used well, a good textbook also offers students an entry point into a subject, but one that should not give a sense of closure Not only do good textbooks leave students with more questions than answers, but it is a matter of how they are used, knowing when to offer a representation and when to show the limits of it. In other words, reductions become pedagogical at the point they are used self-consciously. The self-consciousness of pedagogical reduction has a twofold meaning. Firstly, they should be used self-consciously by the educator who pays attention to their own selection criteria and how that selection influences the student's relation to subject matter. They should ask themselves, what is the basis of my choice? Secondly, pedagogical reductions should be used to cultivate self-consciousness in the student. In other words, that at an appropriate moment, the student is encouraged to become aware that what they see is framed by a point of view. Now, there is a bit more to say about these two forms of self-consciousness. Beginning with the self-consciousness of the educator, let me note that pedagogical reduction is a verb, an activity, a process, as well as a noun or an object, a thing. The educator's activities of pedagogical reduction are aimed at the development of conditions in which the student's relation to something can be improved. While it is always the student who learns or grows, the art of teaching employs a kind of practical wisdom or pedagogical tact to know when and how a particular representation or condition will be effective and when it might not be. The educator's exercise of pedagogical tact depends on skill and experience. The educator reflects upon the proper scope and limits of their influence upon the student. Their concern is not with the student or with content per se, but with the student's relation to content. But it's the second notion of self-consciousness that I think is even more significant for RE. This is because self-consciousness could be understood as subject content itself. Now, in 1982, Jonathan Z. Smith famously observed that the concept of religion is itself a scholastic production. And I want to just quote from Smith, a long quote there, which is on the screen. He said, while there is a staggering amount of data, phenomena of human experiences and expressions that might be characterized in one culture or another, by one criterion or another, as religion, there is no data for religion. Religion is solely the creation of the scholar's study. It is created for the scholar's analytic purposes by his imaginative acts of comparison and generalization. Religion has no independent existence apart from the academy. For this reason, the student of religion, most particularly the historian of religion, must be relentlessly self-conscious. Indeed, this self-consciousness constitutes his primary expertise, his foremost object of study. Now, let me emphasize the really striking claim that the real content of RS in this case, the foremost object of study is not out there, but in here. It's self-consciousness. How we analyze, how we imagine, compare, generalize, in short, how we interpret the world becomes educational content. In encountering some religious phenomena interpreted as religious, we may also come to encounter ourselves. We may come to an understanding that everything we see is shaped by our own point of view. Although self-consciousness is an illuminating term for this, we might also call this the kind of historical consciousness, which I understand here as the awareness that one's historical, social, cultural, and religious circumstances are the product of certain contingencies, and that therefore the categories one uses to understand others and oneself are reflective of those contingencies. This kind of historical consciousness or self-consciousness is characterized by the fact that one can experience one's own relation to subject matter. In other words, the interpretive relation is itself made evident. You feel or you recognize the interpretive relation. One doesn't simply receive what is transmitted, but comes into an interpretive relation to one's content. In contrast to this, then, the problematic form of reductionism is characterized by the fact that it hides the interpretive relation to its subject matter. Reductionism presents content as inert stuff, as piles of knowledge that sit out there. There is no interpretive move to make, it's simply facts. The world religions are then taken to be unproblematically out there, rather than as interpretations, as contingent ways of interpreting human experiences and expressions. This absence of perspective leads to a forgetfulness about the constructed nature of the curriculum, which is not interpreted as preliminary or provisional. Rather, the reductions are thought to be sufficient. The map, to quote again Smith, the map becomes the territory. Okay, so I'm coming towards the end of the talk, you'll be glad to hear. And I just want to make a kind of a conclusion and summarize a little bit. So pedagogical I've said a lot about pedagogical reduction and not that much about how the project's going to go, partly because we're in early stages and we have to see where things are going to go. But pedagogical reduction refers both to the process by which something is made visible, as well as the representation itself. Now, I've argued that in making something visible, the intentions of the educator to show this and not that are important. We need to think about the intentions of the educator. And even if we assume that those intentions are sincerely concerned with educating someone, of course, they still embody the limitations of the perspective of the educator. In other words, their particular orientation, their proclivities, their prejudices, their biases, their idiosyncrasies, and so on and so forth. For this reason, the reduction is always provisional. It is never the final word. Inasmuch as the educator is aware of the provisional status of the representation, we can distinguish pedagogical reduction from reductionism. And when it's forgotten, it becomes reductionism. The reduction is recognized by the educator and perhaps later by the students as an entry point. So the reduction is recognized as an entry point, one that has its scope and limits. Thus, the interpretive relation to subject matter is acknowledged. This means that the view is always provisional and perspectival. There is no view from nowhere. I said that pedagogical reduction is one of several concepts that the After Religious Education project is hoping to explore, and I can't predict where exactly the project will lead or how our conversations will unfold, but certainly I think the general problems of how we frame the subject of RE are raised by exploring the perspectives of teachers and students. The teachers on our project will focus in particular on how this pedagogical logic or aspects of it can be illustrated through the development of exemplary curriculum materials. And I obviously haven't gotten into that today. I haven't gone into detail about what this might look like in practice. I haven't wanted to, because that would be outside of my expertise to some extent. As reports into the future of RE try to take account of changing social and cultural landscape in which the subject exists, just rearranging or expanding content seems like an inadequate response. Reimagining RE brings us back to the basic question of what we hope to achieve through our subject. If critical religious studies tells us anything, it is that reflection on how we look, how we observe, how we interpret, influences what is seen. If we accept that educators are involved in the production of educational reality, then this insight from RS really means that how we represent and reduce the world for pedagogical purposes influences the educational conditions that we create. So thanks very much for your patience in listening to me.